Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take, well, stats of doctrine, strategic intelligence, and try to boil it all down into knowledge you can actually use. Today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, really the mechanics of military power. We're talking joint logistics planning, how we analyze the operational environment, and also operational contract support, how that fits into modern conflict.
It's a critical set of topics.
Our goal today is to kind of give you a shortcut through some dense material, joint publications, historical analysis, threat assessments. We want you to walk away with a solid grasp of how joint forces look at a theater of operations and, maybe just as importantly, how they bring in commercial help to keep things running.
And it's crucial to get this right up front. This isn't just about counting beans or tracking trucks. Joint Publication 4.0, Joint Logistics, is really clear on this. Logistics is more than just support. It's strategic. Good logistics planning gives commanders options, real flexibility, the kind they need to operate across that whole competition continuum, from shaping activities right through to high-intensity conflict.
That's a key distinction, isn't it? Logistics as strategy, not just a supporting function.
Exactly.
I was looking at the U.S. Army Center for Military History's report on logistics in World War II, and it hammers this home. History shows logistics didn't just influence strategy, sometimes it flat out dictated it. If the logistics couldn't support the plan, well, the plan had to change. Simple as that.
Oh, absolutely. That report is full of examples. Strategy and logistics were constantly bumping up against each other. Planners would come up with this grand idea, and the logistics folks would say, well, hang on, we can't move that much fuel, or we can't get that ammo there in time. And that forced the operational planners back to the drawing board. They had to tweak the plan, sometimes radically, until it actually matched what was logistically possible. That back and forth, that reality check, is why setting the theater properly is still so fundamental today.
Okay, so let's dig into that setup process. How do planners actually set the theater today? You mentioned a core tool they use.
Yeah, the foundational piece is the theater logistics analysis. It's this continuous process strategic planners use to get the theater set up and shaped correctly before things kick off.
Theater logistics analysis, okay.
Major General David Wilson and Major Tanya Leonard wrote a great piece on this. Theater logistics analytics, describing, visualizing, understanding the operational environment. They really position the theater logistics analysis as the bedrock for all sustainment prep and planning at that theater level.
So if logistics can dictate strategy, this analysis has got to be pretty comprehensive, right? What's its main job?
Its main job is ongoing, strategic level assessment. It's designed to help the geographic combatant commander set and shape the theater, basically, prepare the ground long before a crisis. It involves digging deep, country by country, across the whole area of responsibility. It pulls together all that critical info needed to understand what capabilities are already there, what the limitations are, what dependencies exist across the region.
And it has to be continuous, I guess, because the situation on the ground is always changing. Agreements shift, infrastructure gets built or degrades, politics evolve.
Precisely. Things are never static.
Okay.
Joint Publication 4.0 actually frames the theater logistics analysis as a kind of supporting process that helps build the theater logistics overview. But Wilson and Leonard add a key clarification.
Okay.
They point out that during Phase 0, that's the shaping, peacetime phase, the analysis itself acts as the theater sustainment common operating picture for the geographic combatant commander. It's the ground truth of the logistics posture right now.
Got it. So it's the raw data, the baseline. Now, if the theater logistics analysis is the engine driving this, what are the main planning products that come out of it? The things that rely on all that detailed analysis.
Right. Wilson and Leonard highlight 3 key products. And honestly, they're pretty much useless without the solid data from the theater logistics analysis feeding into them. Together, these 3 really describe the what, how, and when for sustainment in that theater.
Okay, what are they?
First, you've got the theater logistics overview. That paints the big picture, the overall logistics architecture for the area. Then there's the concept of logistics support, which gets into the specifics of how sustainment will happen across all phases of an operation.
And the third?
The third, and arguably the most critical for validating plans, is the logistics estimate. This is the feasibility check. It tells you if a proposed course of action can actually be supported. You really can't move forward in the joint planning process without these 3, and they all stem from that initial theater logistics analysis.
Makes sense. Foundation first, then build the plan. Okay, let's get into the weeds a bit on the analysis itself. What are the core elements planners are looking at within the operational environment? You mentioned 5 key features.
That's right. The theater logistics analysis dissects 5 critical and interconnected features: threat, geography, host nation agreements, infrastructure, and resources. We should probably start with threat, because that really shapes how vulnerable everything else is.
Okay, threat analysis, what does that involve?
Well, identifying threats, risks, vulnerabilities, that's job number 1. The analysis looks at everything: enemy capabilities, what they've been up to recently, where they're investing long-term, and, critically, who their friends are. What's really interesting, especially drawing lessons from counterinsurgency and thinking about near-peer competitors, is a shift in how we think about targets. Planners are realizing that hitting non-lethal assets, things like sustainment nodes, supply lines, can often be strategically more impactful than hitting enemy shooters directly. Logistics vulnerability, that's often the adversary's highest value target.
So let's talk specifics. Kinetic threats, like chemical weapons, still a concern.
Definitely still a concern. We might think of something like chlorine gas in World War I as a battlefield weapon, right? But Wilson and Leonard point out that modern chemical warfare might be aimed squarely at our major sustainment hubs.
Like ports and airfields.
Exactly. Imagine a chemical attack on an aerial port of debarkation or a seaport of debarkation. That doesn't just pause operations for a bit, it contaminates critical infrastructure. It could paralyze the flow of troops and supplies for days, maybe weeks. So planners have to think about specialized protection, decontamination right from the start in phase 0.
Okay, so kinetic threats are evolving. What about the non-kinetic side, especially from near-peer adversaries?
Yeah, the non-kinetic threats are sophisticated and aimed at paralysis. Cyber warfare is a given, pretty much everywhere. The goal is to get into U.S. networks and degrade the systems that manage sustainment scheduling trains, tracking inventory, you name it. A successful cyber attack could basically blind the entire logistics system.
It sounds...
It is. But there's another, maybe more subtle, non-kinetic tool: economic diplomacy.
Ah, the debt trap diplomacy idea, using loans to gain leverage.
Precisely. Adversaries use heavy investment, sometimes predatory lending, to pull developing nations into, well, forced strategic alliances.
Yeah.
Often, these nations happen to have geographically vital ports or airfields.
Right.
So if the U.S. later needs access, basing rights, or even just overflight permission in that country, that old economic leverage becomes a political roadblock. It could deny the geographic combatant commander access to a critical logistics hub they were counting on. So the theater logistics analysis can't just look at physical infrastructure. It has to map out these political vulnerabilities tied to economic relationships, too.
Wow, that adds a whole other layer of complexity. Okay, let's shift gears to the second feature. Geography and environmental factors. Seems obvious, but geography dictates time and distance, right? Which hits logistics feasibility hard.
It's the ultimate constraint, isn't it? Geography is the one thing you absolutely cannot change. Think about the difference between, say, the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East.
Big difference.
Huge. The Indo-Pacific, vast ocean distances, dispersed island chains. Every move takes a long time, heavily reliant on ships. That massive time-distance factor directly impacts how fast you use supplies and demands robust support hubs along the way.
Whereas the Middle East, mostly land-based, allows for potentially faster ground movement, but relies heavily on roads and rail lines that are, vulnerable.
Exactly. And the geographic combatant commander needs that time-distance calculation baked into their thinking right from the start for deployment planning. Wilson and Leonard also emphasize stuff we might overlook: environmental impacts.
Like weather.
Yeah, extreme heat or cold. It messes with equipment readiness, fuel efficiency, causes heat or cold injuries in troops. Then you have endemic diseases in certain regions, require specific vaccines, protective measures, costing time and money just to keep the force healthy before they even start the mission.
And there's a slow burn environmental factor changing the map, too. Rising sea levels.
Right. This is a quiet but constant threat to coastal logistics. Rising seas mean coastal erosion, which slowly degrades existing infrastructure, especially ports and airfields built near the coast. If the theater logistics analysis shows a key port might become unusable due to erosion in 5 years, planners have to flag that now. It forces them to find alternatives or budget for expensive upgrades or new construction. It really underscores why you need continuous site surveys. The ground truth changes.
Okay, feature number 3, host nation agreements. These are the diplomatic handshakes, the legal paperwork that lets us operate.
They're literally the keys to the kingdom, logistically speaking. 2 main types we need to scrutinize. First is the Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, or ACSA.
ACSA, right.
These are bilateral deals. They let us exchange logistics support, supplies, and services with a partner nation. Think fuel, medical care, using their port facilities, storage, communications, that sort of thing.
But how does that help practically? What's the benefit?
Oh, it's a massive force multiplier. It drastically shrinks the logistics tail we have to drag with us. Instead of shipping everything from the U.S., like huge amounts of standard fuel or basic medical supplies, our forces can potentially tap into host nation stocks right away.
Ah, speeding things up.
Exactly. It facilitates faster initial deployment and takes some pressure off our strategic airlift and sea lift. Big win.
Okay, and the second type of agreement?
That's the Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA. These are unique deals, sometimes bilateral, sometimes multilateral, usually set up in peacetime.
And what do SOFAs cover?
They define the rights and privileges of U.S. forces operating in that country. Wilson and Leonard note they vary a lot, but they cover crucial stuff. Entry and exit rules for people and gear, use of facilities, and maybe most critically, criminal jurisdiction.
Ah, who gets jurisdiction if something goes wrong?
Right. If the Status of Forces Agreement is fuzzy on jurisdiction, even a minor incident involving a U.S. service member could spiral into a complex legal and diplomatic mess. That could potentially paralyze a commander's ability to operate or even move personnel around. So understanding the fine print in these agreements is vital, especially for things like positioning Army preposition stocks and just ensuring we have the freedom to act.
That brings us neatly to the last two features, which are about the physical stuff on the ground. Infrastructure and resources. What kind of local infrastructure are planners looking at?
They need a detailed picture of the host nation's infrastructure that supports moving stuff around. So physical networks, obviously, roads, rail lines, waterways, ports, airfields, bridges, all that dictates how much you can move and how fast.
Right.
But it's also non-physical networks like local communication systems, financial networks. You need reliable comms and quick access to local currency to execute contracts and coordinate movements effectively.
And the resources piece is about what the host nation can provide directly.
Exactly. What local sustainment capacity can we potentially tap into? Planners analyze things like local refineries for fuel, water production plants, sanitation facilities, even manufacturing plants that might be able to repair certain types of equipment, and cold storage for food or medical supplies.
Okay.
This is also where they identify any existing military capability. The host nation has their own sustainment forces, established bases or depots, and really important, the location and status of any existing U.S. Army preposition stocks in the area.
Finding those Army preposition stocks is key, right? Because supporting the geographic combatant commander is always a joint effort. It doesn't matter which service owns the warehouse if it's what's needed now.
Absolutely. Leveraging what's already forward positioned allows for a much faster response in a crisis. Ultimately, as Wilson and Leonard emphasize, the whole point of the theater logistics analysis and the plans that flow from it is to give the joint force a clear picture, identify all the sustainment gaps, and ideally fix them before a lack of support forces operations to grind to a halt prematurely.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly detailed foundational analysis, the theater logistics analysis. How does all that critical data actually get baked into operational plans? Joint Publication 4.0 seems pretty insistent on tight integration.
It's more than just integration. It's about getting involved early. The doctrine is very clear. Logistics planners aren't just there to figure out how to support objectives after the operators decide what they want to do. They need to be in the room to inform those decisions from the start. If the logistics concept to support an operation is impossible, then the operational concept itself is just wishful thinking. Logistics has to provide viable options, and any plan cooked up without that rigorous logistical reality check is pretty much set up to fail.
So let's revisit those three planning products that enforce this integration. First up, the logistics estimate. You called it the feasibility check.
That's exactly what it is. The logistics estimate is where the logistics staff plays the role of, well, the ultimate realist. It's a deep dive into how all the combat service support factors, transport, supply, maintenance, medical capacity, everything, affect the chances of mission success.
How does it work?
It compares the operational plan's requirements side by side with the actual capabilities identified in the theater logistics analysis. Then the staff provides clear conclusions and recommendations on whether a specific course of action is actually supportable.
And if the logistics estimate says, nope, can't support this, what happens then?
Well, if the requirements drastically exceed the capabilities, say, the plan needs fuel delivered at a rate that's physically impossible. Given the port throughput identified in the theater logistics analysis, the logistics staff has to recommend against that course of action.
Forces a rethink.
Completely. It sends the commander and the operational planners back to square one. They might have to change the timeline, scale back the objectives, or maybe even shift the main effort to a different location that is logistically supportable. It's basically the big red stop sign for plans that look good on paper but are impossible in reality.
Okay, then there's the theater logistics overview. That's the big picture architecture document.
Right. The theater logistics overview takes all that granular data from the analysis and translates it into a high-level strategic map of the logistics setup for the entire area of responsibility. It's critical for the Joint Force Commander and their staff because it helps them gauge things like force sustainability, operational reach, how ready the logistics capabilities actually are. It highlights where the gaps are and what risks those gaps create.
And if the risk is just too high, if a gap is identified, that seems insurmountable.
Joint Publication 4.0 is pretty blunt about this. If the risk associated with a logistics gap can't be fixed or mitigated down to an acceptable level, the Joint Force Commander might be forced to reframe the entire operational concept.
Wow, not just tweak it, but fundamentally rethink it.
Potentially, yes. It might mean questioning the core assumptions of the campaign, possibly abandoning that whole line of operation. It really underscores just how powerful logistics is in shaping strategy at the very highest levels.
Okay, and the third product was the concept of logistics support, or COLS.
Right, the concept of logistics support. This is where it becomes operational. It takes the findings from the logistics estimate and starts building the foundation for the logistics annexes you'll see in actual operation orders.
What does it cover specifically?
It sets the priorities for support across all phases of the operation, getting there, fighting, going home. It has to address how forces will be sustained day to day, identify contingency basing options, set movement priorities for ships and planes, and really relevant for our discussion, it must spell out the specific contracting construct that will be used in the theater. It links the plan directly to how operational contract support will be employed.
Right, setting the stage for bringing in those commercial capabilities. Okay, we've laid out this very methodical, very detailed planning process, but like you said, it's happening against a backdrop of modern conflict, large-scale combat operations, that looks very different from the past. The TRADOC G2 assessment you mentioned paints a pretty stark picture for sustainment planners.
It really does. The core takeaway is that we have to ditch the old assumption of a safe, uncontested rear area. That's gone. Large-scale combat operations, as described, are defined by conditions that basically break traditional logistics models.
Let's break down those conditions. First, the transparent battlefield. What does constant surveillance mean for a logistics unit?
It means nowhere to hide, essentially. 24/7 exposure. With cheap, capable sensors everywhere, drones, satellites, cyber snooping, everything connected, there are no safe havens anymore.
So every movement is watched.
Every truck convoy, every fuel dump, every maintenance tent, it's all potentially visible and therefore targetable by the adversary. The old focus on efficiency above all else, that has to shift towards survival. Sustainment units now need to master dispersion, camouflage, hiding their electronic signature, just to stay in the fight.
And if you are seen, the second condition, increased lethality and range, means the consequences are severe.
Absolutely. Modern weapons have the range, the concentration, the precision to hit targets deep in what we used to think of as the safe rear area. This means much higher losses, personnel, equipment. And it puts immense strain on the entire support system all at once. Logistics, medical care, even mortuary affairs. They'll all be stretched thin across huge distances simultaneously.
And the third major condition challenging logistics is anti-accessory denial, or A2AD.
Right. A2AD systems are designed to prevent us from even getting forces into the fight, or at least make it incredibly costly. They deny deployment routes and make it impossible, or extremely risky, to use key sustainment hubs like major ports and airfields, often from very long ranges. The TRADOC G2 report makes it clear. This disrupts everything from mobilization to the flow of forces into theater, undermining our ability to sustain operations over time. It's a fundamental challenge to the entire supply chain.
And we're seeing real-world examples of these contested logistics challenges playing out right now, aren't we? The first example often cited is ammunition consumption in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, that's a stark lesson in targeting the system. Early on, Russian forces were reportedly firing something like 20,000 artillery rounds a day. Massive numbers.
Incredible rate.
But after persistent Ukrainian strikes targeting Russian supply lines, ammo dumps their sustainment network. That rate reportedly dropped dramatically, maybe down to around 5,000 rounds a day. That shows two things really clearly. One, prolonged large-scale combat burns through ammo at an unbelievable rate, demanding huge stockpiles. And two, attacking the enemy's logistics is a very effective way to degrade their combat power.
And the second example involves those Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, highlighting choke point vulnerability.
Right. Those attacks had immediate global consequences. The Red Sea is a vital waterway, handling a huge chunk of global container traffic, maybe 30%. After the attacks ramped up, shipping traffic through the area plummeted, reportedly down by about 90% in just a couple of months.
Wow.
It shows that even relatively low-tech adversaries can find and successfully disrupt major global supply routes at these critical choke points. It creates massive backlogs that affect not just military movements, but the entire global economy. It highlights just how fragile these long supply lines can be.
So if the intelligence analysis says sustainment is a prime target, how does that show up in potential adversary doctrine? You mentioned the Chinese concept of systems destruction warfare.
Yes, systems destruction warfare is a useful concept to understand their thinking. It views conflict not just as attacking enemy tanks or planes, but as targeting the enemy's entire operational system. The goal is paralysis, breaking the essential components that allow the enemy force to function.
What are those components?
They typically identify things like command and control, firepower and strike capabilities, information systems, ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and crucially, the fifth component is support. Sustainment isn't an afterthought in this doctrine. It's explicitly identified as a top-tier, high-priority target. It's a doctrinal statement, really, that the rear area is the new front line.
Okay, so given these immense challenges, the vulnerability of military logistics, the adversary focus on targeting sustainment, leveraging all available resources becomes absolutely critical. This brings us to operational contract support, or OCS. How is that formally defined? Army Technical Publication 410 has a definition, right?
It does. Operational contract support is defined pretty clearly as the process of planning for and obtaining supplies, services, and minor construction from commercial sources, basically.
Yeah.
Hiring companies to support combatant commander-directed operations. And the sources are all in agreement here. Done right, operational contract support is a genuine combat multiplier.
How so?
Well, it provides surge capacity when military capabilities are stretched thin. It brings in specialized skills the military might not have organically. It fills critical gaps, especially when you're talking about the demands of large-scale operations where the military force structure just isn't big enough to do everything itself.
Now, operational contract support isn't just one person's job, right? It involves three distinct functions that need to work together.
That's right, and it's important to understand the differences. First, you have contract support integration, or CSI. This is the planning piece, coordinating and synchronizing all the commercial support needed. It involves figuring out what's required, prioritizing those requirements, and managing the really critical contracted support throughout the operation. It's the big picture oversight.
Okay, function one. What's next?
Second is contracting support, or CS. This is the specialized legal function. It's about actually writing, soliciting, awarding, and administering the contracts that legally bind the commercial company to the government. This is primarily the job of the Army Contracting Command. They're the ones with the legal authority to sign contracts.
Got it. Legal authority. And the third function?
The third is contractor management, or CM. This is the responsibility of the unit that actually needs the service or supply the requiring activity. It's about the day-to-day oversight and integration of the contractor personnel themselves, making sure they're accounted for, that they have the logistical support they need in theater, like housing and food, and managing their force protection.
Now, let's clarify the status of these contractor personnel. This seems to be a common point of confusion. They aren't just soldiers in different uniforms, are they?
Absolutely not. And this is critical. We have to remember, contractors work for commercial businesses. Their primary mission, fundamentally, is to fulfill the contract and make money for their company. They are not combatants.
Which
means they don't have the same protections under the Geneva Conventions that military personnel do. They operate in a completely different legal and operational category.
And there are strict rules about what they can't do, what's called inherently governmental work. This seems like a major boundary commanders need to respect.
Oh, absolutely essential. Contractors are legally prohibited from performing inherently governmental functions. This means they cannot conduct direct offensive combat operations, although they do retain the inherent right to self-defense if attacked. They cannot command or supervise military personnel. They can't perform military-specific duties. And, very importantly, they cannot obligate government resources. They can't sign for property or authorize payments in a way that legally commits government funds. That's where a lot of friction can happen if commanders aren't careful.
Given these legal lines, the roles of the contracting officer's representative, or COR, and the unit commander become really central to making operational contract support work smoothly.
They are absolutely the key players in managing this relationship on the ground. Remember, the contracting officer, usually someone back at Army Contracting Command, is the only person with the legal authority to enter into or modify a contract on behalf of the government.
So the unit commander on the scene can't just tell the contractor to do something extra.
Nope. Even if the commander is in charge of the overall mission, they cannot simply direct the contractor to change the scope of work defined in the contract, add new tasks, or alter the terms of service. Trying to do that creates what's called an unauthorized commitment.
And an unauthorized commitment sounds like something you want to avoid.
You definitely do. It means a government employee like the commander has essentially made a promise the government hasn't legally agreed to pay for. This can potentially leave that individual personally liable for the cost, or at least facing serious administrative or disciplinary action. It's a career risk.
So how does the commander exert influence correctly? Where are the right intervention points?
The commander needs to focus their influence at specific critical points in the process. First, during requirements generation, making sure the need is defined clearly and accurately before it goes to the contracting officer. Second, providing input during contract award, helping ensure the government selects the best company for the job. And third, and most continuously, during contract administration, that's the execution phase, overseeing performance. And the commander's key player here is the COR.
Okay, tell us more about the contracting officer's representative, the COR. What's their specific role? You mentioned a kind of dual reporting.
Yeah, the COR is usually nominated by the commander of the unit receiving the service, but they're formally appointed in writing by the actual contracting officer. Think of them as the government's eyes and ears on the ground, monitoring the contract. They do have a bit of a dual reporting line. They report on mission accomplishment. Is the contractor actually delivering what the unit needs back to their unit commander?
Yeah.
But they report on quality assurance and technical performance. Is the contractor meeting the specific standards laid out in the contract? Back to the contracting officer. They manage the process, the paperwork, ensure standards are met, and prevent that unauthorized scope creep.
Okay, that clarifies the COR role. Lastly, we should touch on the broader legal environment contractors work in overseas. It's not just the contract itself, right?
No, it's more complex.
Yeah.
Domestically, U.S. contractors overseas can be subject to certain U.S. federal laws, like the Military Extraterritorial Judicial Act or parts of the Patriot Act, for crimes committed abroad. Internationally, their presence and activities are often governed by those status of forces agreements we discussed earlier.
What about military law, the Uniform Code of Military Justice?
Applying the Uniform Code of Military Justice to civilian contractors is legally very complicated and generally reserved only for serious, violent crimes. And even then, it typically requires specific approval from the U.S. Department of Justice. So it's not a routine tool for discipline for contractors like it is for soldiers.
And managing the actual workforce, who the contractors hire, adds another layer of complexity.
It definitely does. International factors often complicate things. There might be restrictions on hiring people from third countries, complex visa requirements to get workers into the host nation, and frequently requirements imposed by the host country that a certain percentage of the contractor's workforce must be local nationals. So this whole web of legal constraints, visa rules, local labor laws, it all has to be factored into the planning, ideally back when the concept of logistics support is being developed, to make sure the contract is actually executable legally and effectively once boots are on the ground.
This has been a really comprehensive look at the engine room of joint operations. We've seen how that foundational theater logistics analysis covering threats, geography, agreements, infrastructure, resources is absolutely essential for understanding the environment and trying to mitigate those serious vulnerabilities that modern large-scale combat operations bring to the table.
And it really brings us back to that core message from Joint Publication 4.0, doesn't it? Logistics planning isn't separate from operational planning. It has to be integrated right from the beginning, at every level, trying to develop operational concepts without that constant logistics reality check, without the feasibility analysis from the logistics estimate, or understanding the risks highlighted in the theater logistics overview. Well, it just doesn't lead to success.
We've established that modern conflict, with its transparent battlefields and aggressive anti-access systems, means sustainment itself is now a prime target. Adversaries using concepts like systems destruction warfare are looking to cripple that support network. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, the planner. to wrestle with.
Yet, given that sustainment is now explicitly in the crosshairs, targeted across all domains, how do you need to fundamentally change your planning assumptions? You can no longer assume rear areas are safe havens. How do you integrate the protection and resilience of every element, including those potentially vulnerable operational contract support assets, into your future plans? Because defending the supply line isn't just a logistics task anymore, it has to be an integral part of the operational scheme itself.
A really critical question for anyone planning for future conflicts. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.